slides pulled up here. You guys see the full screen slide?
Yep.
Perfect. All right. Cool. Then let's get started. Oops. All right. Well, hi, everybody. My name is Haley Uremich. Like Matt mentioned, I'm an analytics software tester here in the Jump R&D group. A little bit about me. I got my PhD in quantitative psychology from Vanderbilt University. So I come from the world of social science. Prior to getting my PhD, I worked at the National Institutes of Health for a couple of years as a research fellow. And prior to that, I got my undergrad degree at the University of Michigan, where I studied psychology and statistics. So yeah, looking forward to talking to you all today about this add-in. All right, so I like to start off with an example just to kind of get us all acquainted with these ideas of moderation and mediation and moderated mediation. So this is a clip that I found from a website called thescienceofpeople.com, and it was an article about job satisfaction. So this clip reads, do you know the impact of your work? When we don't have our why at the front of our mind, it can be hard to feel motivated and excited about what we're doing. When we get busy or overwhelmed, the why just seems to slip away. So this clip tells us that when we feel like our work has meaning, this tends to lead to greater job satisfaction. And so with a path diagram, we would display that cause and effect relationship like this. However, if we were too overwhelmed at work, this relationship might begin to diminish or slip away. So the meaningfulness of our work should be related to job satisfaction, but only if overwhelm is low. And conceptually, we could represent that like this with the following path diagram. And in the social sciences, this is what we refer to as moderation, such that overwhelm moderates the relationship between meaningfulness and job satisfaction. But more widely, this would be known as an interaction. So there might be an interaction between overwhelm and meaningfulness of our work. And so, if we were to fit an interaction like a model with an interaction and find that it was significant, we would want to visualize it in order to understand what's going on and how these variables are interacting and affecting one another. And so, to do that, a common approach is to look at something called a simple slopes plot. And so a simple slope describes the relationship between our predictor and our outcome at a particular value of the moderator. So in this plot, we're looking at the relationship between our meaningfulness of our work and job satisfaction at three different levels of overwhelm. And so the red line is that relation when overwhelm is low. And usually in practice, this would be 1 or 2 standard deviations below the mean. The blue line is when overwhelm is at its mean, and then the purple line is when overwhelm is high. And this might be something like 1 or 2 standard deviations above the mean. And so, just in line with what we would expect from that clip, this relationship between meaningfulness and job satisfaction is the strongest when overwhelm is low. And then when overwhelm is high, that relationship is weakened. And so being able to visualize simple slopes like this is a really useful and often an essential part of fitting and understanding models that involve moderation. And in addition to a plot like this, we often need or want a little bit more detail about the values of these simple slopes, as well as their statistical significance at different levels of the moderator. And just as an example, I've shown that here for high and low levels of overwhelm. And so beyond a simple slopes plot, we can kind of take things a step further. And there are other methods that we can use to get even richer information about the nature of this moderation. And so one state-of-the-art method for doing this, which is very popular in the social sciences, is something called the Johnson-Neiman technique. And so this technique provides a lot more detail than a simple slopes plot. So let me start just by sort of explaining what we're looking at here in this plot. So here we're actually putting the moderator on the x-axis. So we have overwhelm on the x-axis, and then the y-axis is the simple slope. So the y-axis is the strength of the relation between our predictor and our outcome at a given value of the moderator. And our confidence band tells us about our certainty about that simple slope estimate. And so here we're looking at that effect at each possible value of overwhelm. And just like before, we're seeing that that effect is weakening as overwhelm increases. So this is leading us to the same conclusions as before, just giving us a little bit more detail. because we're getting information about the relationship between meaningfulness and job satisfaction, as well as our certainty about that relationship at every value of the moderator rather than just a few, like the 3 values of overwhelm that we looked at in the prior plot. Now we're looking at every value of the moderator. And in addition, we can color code this plot. So here I've color coded the confidence band such that a blue confidence band means that the simple slope is statistically significant. So it's statistically significantly different from 0 at these levels of overwhelm where the band is blue. And then where the band is red, it means that the simple slope is not significantly different from 0. And finally, related to that, another really nice aspect of the Johnson-Neiman technique is that we can calculate these things called significance boundaries. And so a significance boundary is the exact value of the moderator at which this simple slope goes from being statistically significant to non-significant. So again, just getting a lot more detail, a lot richer information about the nature of this moderation and how these variables all relate to each other. Okay, and we can also take our modeling a step further beyond simple moderation. So coming back to our example clip, the clip also mentions that the meaningfulness of our work should result in greater job satisfaction because it tends to lead to greater motivation at work. So there might be a cause and effect pathway going on, and this is what we would call mediation, such that motivation is mediating this relationship between meaningfulness of our work and job satisfaction. So motivation would be our mediator here. But again, overwhelm still needs to remain low in order for this cause and effect pathway to kind of play out. And so we might expect that overwhelm needs to be low in order for this first piece of the causal pathway to be present, to be strong. And so we refer to this model as first stage moderated mediation. Or similarly, we might think that low overwhelm is more important for the second effect to be present. And this model is what we call second stage moderated mediation. And so in these moderated mediation models, if we were to fit them and find a significant interaction, we would still want to probe that and assess significance at different levels of the moderator and create those plots that I just introduced. But this time, we're usually interested in plotting and testing this entire effect of meaningfulness on job satisfaction through motivation. And so we call this a conditional indirect effect because this is an indirect effect because it's traveling through a mediator and it's conditional on the value of our moderator. And I'll show an example of a moderated mediation model in our demo in a few minutes. And so kind of with all that background in mind, I just wanted to briefly summarize the features of the add-in that I'm going to be demoing today. So I'll go over the features of the add-in as well as kind of what you might be up against or the struggles you might face if you wanted to fit these models and create these plots, but without using the add-in. So first we've automated all the details of model fitting. And without the add-in, there's often some data pre-processing that's involved, and it can be difficult to specify the correct model. So this add-in works on top of the structural equation modeling platform in JMP, and often even just specifying the correct structural equation model can be a challenge. So we take care of all that in an automated way. We also provide detailed numeric output about the model, but we also sift through that output and do the further calculations that are needed to make sense of the output and to create those plots. And of course, all the visualizations are automated. So we're going to create a simple slopes plot and a Johnson-Neiman plot. And without the add-in, it can be quite difficult to create these plots from scratch, especially the Johnson-Neiman plot. Because the formulas that underlie those plots are quite complex and pretty ugly. So using the add-in just means that we get to avoid those complex formulas. And just to give you a sense of what those formulas look like, so if I were to fit one of these models and I wanted to kind of get from those model estimates to these plots, what would I have to contend with? So these are some of the ugly formulas that underlie the elements of those plots that I just introduced. So just wanted to give you a sense of how cumbersome it can be to create these graphs from scratch. So the goal of the add-in was really to ease the burden of all of these steps of the modeling process. So not only fitting these models in an automated way, but also by creating these visualizations automatically, so that users don't really have to contend with anything big or ugly like this. Okay, so at this point, I can jump over to a demo. And so I'm going to be demoing a second stage moderated mediation model today. Can you guys see my jump window here?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so um, and like Matt mentioned, this add-in is up in the marketplace. And so if you look at the marketplace listing, and I've also included a link to it in my final slide, the add-in can be downloaded along with 3 simulated data sets that kind of go with each of the 3 models that the add-in offers. So moderation, first stage moderated mediation, and second stage moderated mediation. So feel free to download those and kind of play around with all the options. But today I'm just going to be focusing on second stage moderated mediation. And these are all data sets that I simulated to kind of be consistent with that example that I went over earlier. So we just have our 4 variables here, meaningfulness of our work. We have overwhelm, motivation, and satisfaction. So I'm going to go to my add-ins. And when I hover over the moderation and mediation add-in, I have my 3 options. So each of those 3 models that I just introduced. So I'll go to second stage, and this is what I see. So like I mentioned earlier, one kind of difficult aspect of fitting these models can be understanding how to make the jump from a conceptual representation of the model to the statistical model that actually needs to be fit in the SEM platform. And so the goal of these figures here is just to take away that burden for users. So on the left is what we sort of theorize or think is going on conceptually. But on the right is the actual statistical model that corresponds to that and what's going to be fit in the platform. And so the only input that I need to give as the user is just to select a variable for each role in this model. So my focal predictor is going to be meaningfulness of my work. My moderator is overwhelm. Mediator is motivation. And my outcome is job satisfaction. And if I had additional variables that I wanted to control for or include as covariates, I could select those here. And then by default, any variables that are involved in the interaction, so anything involved in a product term like this, is going to be mean centered. So that's kind of like standard best practice is to mean center things that are involved in an interaction. But if you wanted to turn off centering, you could do that here, or you could maybe choose to center around a value other than the mean, perhaps the median. So those are some options here. For today, I'm going to leave everything at the default. And then this final piece of the launch window just concerns what's going to be shown in my output report. So the default behavior of the add-in is to show the Johnson-Niemann plot and the simple slopes plot only if the moderation is statistically significant. Using alpha 0.05, but I could choose to show those plots regardless of statistical significance. So maybe I wanted to use a different significance level. So you could check that box here if you wanted to. I simulated these data, so I know it's going to be significant regardless. So I'm going to leave that unchecked for today. So I've given my input, so I can click OK to fit the model. And so this is what I see. So the first thing that we get is output from the structural equation modeling platform. So I have all my parameter estimates. I have some information about how the model fits to my data. But as you can see, this output can be kind of a lot to sift through. And so where I like to go is this moderation detail section. So the goal of this section was basically to pull out all the important parts of the SEM output and then to do any necessary computations on that output and really just package everything into sentences that can be easily understood or copy and pasted into a report or a publication. And so the first thing we see is just a little bit of detail about whether that moderation was statistically significant. We get some detail about the conditional indirect effects. And so again, these are very similar to simple slopes, but now we call them indirect effects because there's a mediator in this model. So the effect of meaningfulness on job satisfaction is traveling through motivation here. So I get a little information about the values of those indirect effects at a few different levels of the moderator, as well as their statistical significance. And then I get a little bit of detail about the Johnson-Niemann results. So before we get to that, let me scroll down to this plot. So this is our Johnson-Niemann plot. And as a refresher, here we have the moderator on the x-axis. So I have overwhelm on the x-axis. And then on the y-axis, I have the conditional indirect effect of meaningfulness on job satisfaction through motivation. And that effect is what's changing as a function of overwhelm. And again, we're looking at that effect at each possible value of overwhelm. And we can see that the effect is weakening as overwhelm increases. But one sort of drawback of this plot is that it can sometimes be hard for people to wrap their head around kind of what we're looking at here because we have an effect on the y-axis. So that can be a little bit confusing. So as in this example, this trend or this line that we're seeing in the Johnson-Niemann plot is negative, but most of these effects are positive. Most of them are greater than 0. They're just becoming less positive as overwhelm increases. So that can sort of just be hard to wrap your head around. And so to make things even clearer, I added graphlets to this plot. So what I can do is I can hover over this line and a graphlet is going to appear that shows me the relationship between meaningfulness and job satisfaction at this particular value of overwhelm. So we're seeing here that when overwhelm is low, that effect is strong and positive. And then when overwhelm is at sort of a medium level, that effect is still positive. It's just becoming less positive. And then as overwhelm continues to increase, that effect is getting weaker. So the line is getting flatter. And then eventually when overwhelm is really high, there's really no effect anymore. So a really big advantage of JUMP is that we could add these graphlets to really aid user understanding in terms of what we're looking at here. And then of course we have our significance boundaries as well. So again, this is the exact value of overwhelm at which this effect goes from being statistically significant to non-significant. And so typically when we implement the Johnson-Niemann technique, there are going to be 2 significance boundaries that are calculated. And so up here in the details section, you can see there are 2 values, but sometimes, as in this example, only one of those values is within the observed range of the moderator. So we only see one boundary in our plot because this plot is only going to display the values of overwhelm that were observed in the data. And we do that for extrapolation control. So here, based on these results, we can say that as long as overwhelm is less than this boundary, which is about 1.25, that there's going to be a significant effect of meaningfulness on job satisfaction through motivation. And then the last piece of output that we see is this conditional indirect effects plot, which again is super similar to a simple slopes plot. Basically what this does is just kind of pulls out a few graphlets at 3 specific values of overwhelm, which here is 1 standard deviation above and below the mean as well as the mean, and just kind of puts them into a static plot. So same idea, same conclusions as before. But a plot like this is often useful. We often need it for our reports or our publications. So wanted to include that here as well. And this is linked to Graph Builder. So you can, click on any of this to edit or change the colors or anything that you might need to do for your report. So yeah, that is kind of what we get from the add-in. And with that, I can jump back over to my slides to wrap up. Okay, yeah, so here's a link to the add-in listing in the marketplace. And then I also wrote a blog post that goes over the add-in in more detail of just everything that I can do. So feel free to check out that blog post as well. And yeah, that's all I've got. So thank you so much for listening, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.